There is something happening beneath the world you are watching. Not beneath it in the way that secrets are buried, not concealed by those who forgot to tell you, not hidden behind walls that simply need to be torn down. Beneath it, in the way that depth is beneath a surface. Beneath it, the way that the ocean floor exists beneath the wave you can see. The wave is real, but it is not the whole truth. And if you have only ever watched the wave, you have mistaken the thinnest expression of something vast for the thing itself. You have been watching a world. You have been watching conflict and noise and headlines and movements and counter-movements and the endless churning of events that seem to demand your attention, your reaction, your fear, your hope. And somewhere inside you, something has been quietly insisting that what you are watching is not the real story, not paranoia, not escapism, something more precise than either of those. A recognition, a sense that the stage in front of you is not the theater, that the performance is not the event, that beneath everything you have been told to watch, something else entirely is completing itself. That sense is correct. And today, we are going beneath it. Not to the comfortable layer where someone hands you a different narrative and tells you that is the real one. Not to the layer where you simply swap one surface story for another. We are going to the layer that changes the meaning of every layer above it. The layer that, once seen, makes it impossible to watch the surface the same way again. The layer that the most ancient maps of human consciousness pointed to long before any of this noise existed. The layer that quantum mechanics, in its most precise and unnerving discoveries, has been quietly describing for nearly a century, without most people understanding what it was actually saying. Reality has two layers, not metaphorically, not as a spiritual comfort, structurally, demonstrably. The world you observe and the world that is generating what you observe are not the same world. They operate by different rules. They respond to different forces. And the war that is actually being fought, the endgame that is actually unfolding, is happening in the layer most people have never been shown. That is what this transmission is about. We are going to start at the surface. We are going to look at what most people see and believe they understand. Then we are going to peel it back, layer by layer, the quantum mechanics beneath the material, the ancient wisdom beneath the quantum, the nature of the real battle beneath the apparent one, and finally the thing at the core that has been hidden in plain sight for the entirety of human history, not because someone locked it away, but because the layer above it was so loud, so vivid, so compelling, that almost no one ever looked beneath it long enough to find it. Until now. Let us begin at the surface. The layer you know. The world is in motion. You can see it. Every day brings new evidence of systems straining, institutions cracking, certainties dissolving. The political landscape is unrecognizable compared to a generation ago. The information environment is a hall of mirrors where the same event produces 100 contradictory realities, depending on which frequency you are tuned to. The economic structures that were supposed to be permanent are proving themselves to be fragile arrangements that serve some purposes and not others. There is acceleration everywhere. The pace of change has outrun the human capacity to process it. And beneath the acceleration, there is a feeling that something is being decided, something large, something that cannot be undone. Most people experience this as chaos, and at the surface level, that is an accurate description. The surface is chaotic. The surface is loud. The surface is designed, whether by intention or by the natural dynamics of complex systems, to absorb the totality of your attention. Every headline is urgent. Every conflict demands a side. Every development requires a response. And in the relentless demand for your attention is consumed entirely by the surface. That is the first thing to understand about the surface layer. It is not merely what you see. It is a system that perpetuates itself by making itself the only thing you can see. The surface is not passive. It is active. It reaches for your awareness and holds it. And as long as it holds your awareness, the layer beneath it remains invisible. This is not a conspiracy. This is the nature of surfaces. A painting does not hide the canvas beneath it through malice. The painting simply is what it is, and the canvas is simply what it is. And as long as you are looking at the painting, the canvas does not announce itself. But peel back the painting and the canvas is there. It was always there. It was beneath the image the entire time. Now let us peel back the first layer. What most people call the world, what most people mean when they say reality, is not the base layer of existence. It is a constructed experience. Not constructed in the sense that it is fake. Not constructed in the sense that the suffering in it is not real or the events in it are not happening. Constructed in the sense that what you experience as solid, fixed, and final is actually a rendering, an output, the product of a process happening at a layer you cannot see with ordinary perception. This is not philosophy. This is what physics discovered. In the early 20th century, a group of scientists began doing something that had never quite been done before. They stopped accepting the surface of matter as the final answer and started asking what was beneath it. What is matter actually made of? Not what does it look like, not what does it do, but what is it at its deepest accessible layer? And what they found there should have rewritten every assumption humanity held about the nature of reality. In many ways, it still has not fully landed, because what they found was so strange, so incompatible with the surface layer understanding, that even the scientists who discovered it spent decades arguing about what it meant. What they found was this: beneath the solid, definite, fixed surface of matter, there is no solid, definite, fixed layer. There is a field of probability, a quantum field in which particles do not have fixed positions, fixed states, or fixed properties until they are observed. Before observation, a particle exists in what is called superposition. It is not here or there. It is not spinning this way or that. It is in a state of pure potential, a probability distribution across all possible states simultaneously. The moment it is observed, the moment awareness interacts with it, it collapses from probability into a specific, definite, measurable reality. Read that again slowly, because the implication is staggering. The layer beneath matter is not more matter. The layer beneath the solid world is not a more solid world. The layer beneath the fixed is not more fixedness. The layer beneath what you call reality is a field of pure potential that does not become definite until consciousness engages with it. The surface tells you that reality is solid and consciousness is a product of it. The depth tells you the exact opposite. Consciousness is what collapses potential into reality. The observer is not separate from the observed. The act of looking is not passive, it is generative. It is, at the quantum level, the mechanism by which the indefinite becomes definite, by which the possible becomes actual, by which the field becomes the particle, by which the depth becomes the surface. This is where the veil lifts for the first time. What you have been calling the world, the solid, fixed, given world that you navigate and react to and try to survive within, is not the base layer. It is the output of a process, and that process involves, at its most fundamental level, the participation of consciousness, not as a spectator, as a participant, as, in some precise sense, that physics is still working to fully articulate a cause. Now, sit with that for a moment, because what this means for everything you are watching unfold in the world right now is profound in a way that most surface-level analysis never reaches. If the layer beneath matter is a field of potential that responds to observation, to consciousness, to awareness, then the most important thing in any moment is not what is happening at the surface. The most important thing is what is happening at the level of consciousness that is observing the surface. The most important thing is not the event, it is the awareness that meets the event, because that awareness is not merely witnessing a fixed reality. At the deepest layer of what physics has found, that awareness is participating in the collapse of potential into the specific reality that manifests. This is not comfortable. It is not a feel-good message. It is a precise and somewhat unsettling description of how the layer beneath matter actually operates. And here is what makes it directly relevant to everything you are watching in the world right now. If consciousness is the mechanism by which potential becomes actual, then the most powerful thing anyone could control is not territory, not resources, not even information. The most powerful thing to control is the state of human consciousness. Because a consciousness in a particular state, fear, fragmentation, reactivity, limitation, collapses potential into a particular kind of reality. A consciousness in a different state, clarity, wholeness, creative authority, collapses potential into a fundamentally different reality. The surface layer of the world is a war over territory, resources, and narratives. That war is real. But it is not the deepest war. The deepest war, the one happening in the hidden layer, is a war over the state of human consciousness. Because whoever determines the state of human consciousness determines what kind of reality gets collapsed out of the quantum field into actuality. This is the spiritual endgame, not as metaphor, as mechanism. If this transmission is taking you somewhere the surface layer never has, like it and subscribe so the next layer reaches you when it drops. Now let us go deeper. But there is a layer beneath that. Before we go to it, let us look at something that the source transcript touches on with great precision, something that needs to be understood at a deeper level than it is usually stated. The claim that there are those who understand the architecture of consciousness and use that understanding to shape collective perception. Let us not treat this as a simple villain narrative. Let us treat it as a structural observation about layers of knowledge. Throughout human history, in every civilization that has left records, there has been a distinction between exoteric knowledge and esoteric knowledge. Exoteric knowledge is the surface layer. It is what is taught publicly, what is available to everyone, what forms the shared understanding of a culture. Esoteric knowledge is the hidden layer. It is the understanding of the mechanisms beneath the surface, the principles that govern how reality actually operates at deeper levels, the knowledge that was considered too powerful, too destabilizing, or too easily misused to be widely distributed. This is not a paranoid observation. It is a historical fact documented in the records of every major civilization. The mystery schools of ancient Egypt, the inner circles of the Pythagorean tradition, the Hermetic orders of the Renaissance, the Kabbalistic schools of Jewish mysticism, the Tantric traditions of India, the Taoist inner alchemy traditions of China. In every case, there was an outer teaching and an inner teaching, a surface layer available to the general population and a deeper layer reserved for those who have been prepared to receive it without being destroyed by it or using it harmfully. The inner teachings were not arbitrary secrets. They were maps of the hidden layer of reality, maps of the quantum field before quantum mechanics existed, maps of how consciousness interacts with the structure of existence, maps of how awareness shapes what manifests. And these maps were kept hidden not only to protect the knowledge, but to protect those who might misuse it. Now here is the layer beneath that. The same principle that motivated the protective concealment of esoteric knowledge also created the possibility of its weaponization. If you understand how consciousness shapes reality, you can use that understanding to help people become more conscious, more free, more capable of creative participation in the generation of their own reality. Or you can use that understanding to keep people less conscious, more fragmented, more reactive, less capable of recognizing their own generative power. The same map can lead to liberation or to a more sophisticated form of captivity. This is not speculation. This is the logical implication of the knowledge itself. If consciousness is the mechanism by which potential becomes actual, then knowledge of how consciousness operates is the most powerful knowledge that exists. And like all powerful knowledge, it can be used in multiple directions. The question that the spiritual endgame raises is not whether such knowledge exists. It does. The question is not whether it has been used to shape human consciousness at a collective level. It has been. The question is whether you are going to remain at the surface layer, where you are a passive recipient of whatever reality is being collapsed out of the field by the aggregate state of consciousness around you, or whether you are going to go to the deeper layer where you understand the mechanism and reclaim your participation in it. Let us go deeper. There is a parable that belongs here. Not an ancient one, though it mirrors ancient stories precisely. A more immediate one. Imagine a city that has been built over centuries, layer upon layer, each generation building on the foundations of the previous one, rarely asking what lies beneath those foundations, simply accepting the streets and buildings as given, as fixed, as the nature of things. In this city lives a woman named Mara. Mara is intelligent. She reads the news. She follows the politics. She understands, better than most, the mechanics of the surface. She knows which forces are aligned with which interests. She can trace the flow of power through institutions. She is, by any surface-level measure, awake to how the world works. But Mara has never looked beneath the city. One day, the city begins to shake. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but with a persistent, low-frequency trembling that the engineers cannot explain and the authorities dismiss as normal settling. Mara notices it. Others notice it too, but most of them explain it away. They have too much invested in the surface to consider what a trembling beneath it might mean. Mara does not explain it away. She begins to ask a different question, not what is happening on the surface, but what is happening beneath it. She finds, in the archives of the city's oldest library, documents that were never widely distributed. Maps, not of the city as it stands, but of what lies beneath it. And what those maps reveal is astonishing. The city was built on the ruins of a previous city, and that city was built on the ruins of one before it. And beneath all of them, at the deepest accessible layer, is something that was not built at all, a natural formation, a structure that preceded all the construction above it, a foundation that the builders of every subsequent layer had used without understanding what they were using. And the maps, the old ones, the ones that were never widely distributed, describe that foundation in precise detail. They describe its properties. They describe how it responds to certain kinds of pressure. They describe what happens when the layers above it are built in alignment with its properties, and what happens when they are built in opposition to them. The trembling, Mara realizes, is not random. It is not mere settling. It is the response of the deepest layer to the weight of everything built on top of it in misalignment with its nature. The surface is shaking because the foundation is communicating, and no one at the surface level has been listening. Mara does not tear down the city. She does not declare war on the architects of the surface. She does something more powerful. She learns the language of the foundation. She learns what the deepest layer is communicating through the trembling. And she begins to share what she finds, not as a declaration of emergency, not as a call to panic, but as a translation. Here is what the depth is saying. Here is what the foundation requires. Here is what alignment with the deepest layer looks like from the surface. And the trembling gradually begins to change in character. Not because the surface was fixed, but because enough people learned to listen to the depth. You are Mara. You have always been Mara. The trembling you feel when you watch the world right now is not anxiety. It is not weakness. It is your awareness registering something that the surface layer cannot account for. It is the depth communicating through you. And the question is whether you will explain it away or whether you will learn to translate it. What was the moment you first felt the trembling and knew the surface wasn't giving you the full answer? Drop it in the comments. The depth seekers gathering here are listening. Now let us go to the quantum layer beneath the parable. The field that quantum mechanics describes, the quantum field of potential that underlies all manifest reality, has a property that is almost never discussed in popular science communication because it is so strange that it tends to produce more confusion than clarity when explained superficially. That property is called non-locality. Non-locality means that quantum particles that have interacted with each other remain correlated regardless of the distance between them. Change the state of one particle and the correlated particle instantaneously reflects that change, not after a delay proportional to the distance between them, but instantaneously, regardless of whether they are in the same room or on opposite sides of the universe. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. He found it deeply disturbing because it violated his conviction that nothing could travel faster than light. But experiment after experiment has confirmed it. Quantum entanglement is real. Non-locality is real. The quantum field does not respect the separations that appear at the surface level. What this means is that the hidden layer of reality is not divided the way the surface layer appears to be divided. At the surface, you and I are separate. You are here and I am there. What happens to you does not instantaneously affect me unless there is a causal chain connecting us through the surface layer of space and time. But at the quantum layer, separation is not the fundamental condition. Connection is. Entanglement is. The field is non-local. It is, in some sense, that physicists are still working to fully describe, a unified whole that only appears divided at the surface level. Now bring this back to consciousness. If consciousness is what collapses potential into actuality, and if the field in which that potential exists is non-local and fundamentally unified, then what happens when a large number of consciousnesses are in the same state simultaneously? What happens when millions of people are simultaneously in a state of fear, fragmentation, and reactive attention? What kind of reality does that aggregate consciousness collapse out of the unified field? And conversely, what happens when even a smaller number of consciousnesses achieve a different state? What kind of reality does a consciousness in clarity, in wholeness, in what the ancient traditions called alignment with the deepest layer, collapse out of the same field? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that the spiritual endgame is actually about. And it is the question that the hidden layer of every wisdom tradition in human history has been attempting to address. Let us go to the ancient layer now, because this is where the maps were drawn. Long before quantum mechanics existed as a formal discipline, long before the instruments existed to detect the quantum field directly, the inner traditions of every major civilization were mapping it, not with the language of physics, not with the mathematics of wave functions and probability amplitudes, but with the language of consciousness, energy, and the structure of awareness itself. The Vedantic tradition of ancient India described Brahman, the undifferentiated ground of all existence, as the layer beneath all manifest reality. Not a god in the personal sense, not a being with preferences and moods, but the field of pure consciousness from which all specific forms arise. The manifest world, what they called Maya, was not an illusion in the sense of being unreal. It was a surface layer, a rendering, a specific crystallization of something infinite and formless into something finite and formed. And the practice of the tradition was precisely the practice of learning to perceive beneath the surface layer, to recognize the ground of pure potential beneath the manifest world, and in doing so, to shift one's relationship to the manifest world fundamentally. The Taoist tradition described the Tao, the way, as the unnamable ground beneath all named things. The Tao that can be named, the text begins, is not the eternal Tao. The surface layer can be named. The depth cannot, not because it is mystical nonsense, but because names are surface layer tools, and the depth precedes all surface layer categories. The Taoist inner practices were practices of aligning with the Tao, with the deep current beneath the surface turbulence, and learning to act from that alignment rather than from the reactive surface. The Hermetic tradition, which flowed from ancient Egypt through the Greco-Roman world and into the Renaissance, described it through the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The hidden layer and the manifest layer are not separate systems. They correspond. What happens at the level of consciousness is reflected in the level of manifest reality. The inner and the outer are two layers of the same thing, and the practitioner who learns to work at the inner layer, the hidden layer, the quantum layer in today's language, works at the level that generates the outer. The Kabbalistic tradition mapped the hidden layers of reality through the structure of the tree of life, a diagram of the emanations from the infinite through progressively denser layers of reality down to the manifest world. Each layer was a different mode of existence, a different quality of consciousness, a different relationship between potential and actual. And the practice was the practice of ascending through the layers, of learning to perceive and operate at progressively deeper levels of the structure, moving from the surface toward the source. What all of these traditions share, beneath their very different languages and cultural contexts, is a structural understanding that is precisely what quantum mechanics has now confirmed at the level of physics. Reality is layered. The surface is not the foundation. Beneath the manifest is a field of potential. Consciousness is the mechanism of interaction between the hidden layer and the manifest layer, and the state of consciousness determines what kind of reality manifests. This is not coincidence, this is convergence. Two entirely different methodologies, one using the instruments of inner awareness cultivated over millennia of dedicated practice, and one using the instruments of physics developed over the last century, arriving at the same structural description of reality from opposite directions. The ancient ones mapped the hidden layer from the inside. The physicists found it from the outside. They are describing the same territory. And here is what that convergence means for the spiritual endgame that is unfolding right now. The endgame is not primarily a political event. It is not primarily an economic event. It is not primarily a technological event, though it is expressing itself through all of those domains at the surface layer. The endgame is a consciousness event. It is the moment in the long arc of human development when the hidden layer can no longer remain hidden, when the pressure from the depth is sufficient to crack the surface, when enough people have been pushed far enough by the chaos of the surface that they are forced to ask the question that leads beneath it. What is actually happening here? Not what is the next development in the narrative. Not which faction is winning. Not what should I be afraid of or hopeful about. But what is actually happening at the layer beneath all of this? What is the deep structure of this moment? What is the field generating this surface? That question is the crack in the veil. And once the question is genuinely asked, the answer begins to come. But there is a layer beneath that. Because the endgame has two dimensions that operate simultaneously and in opposition, and understanding both is essential to understanding what is actually at stake. The first dimension is the dimension of contraction, the attempt, whether by deliberate design or by the natural dynamics of systems that benefit from unconsciousness, to keep human awareness locked at the surface layer, to keep consciousness fragmented, reactive, distracted, and unaware of its own generative power, to maintain the conditions under which the hidden layer remains hidden and the surface layer remains the only reality most people can access. This is not a cartoonish evil. It is, as the source material rightly identifies, a sophisticated system. And its sophistication lies precisely in its alignment with the surface layer properties of human consciousness. Human consciousness at the surface level is naturally drawn to novelty, to threat, to social belonging, to the reduction of uncertainty. These are not weaknesses. They are features of a consciousness adapted to navigate a physical world. But they are also the exact levers that a system of surface-level control would use to keep awareness locked at the surface. The endless stream of novelty, the perpetual manufacture of threat, the social pressure of collective agreement about what is real, the promise of certainty in exchange for the surrender of independent inquiry. These are not random features of the modern information environment. They are, at minimum, the natural expression of systems that benefit from surface-level consciousness. And at maximum, they are the deliberate architecture of a system that understands exactly what it is doing. But here is where the analysis must go deeper than most surface-level treatments take it. The system of surface-level control is not the deepest layer of what is happening. It is itself a surface layer over something deeper. The attempt to keep consciousness contracted is not the end game. It is the response to the end game. It is the defensive move of a system that senses, at some level, that the expansion it is trying to prevent is coming anyway. Because the second dimension of what is unfolding is the dimension of expansion, the natural movement of consciousness toward its own depth. The long arc of human awareness bending toward the recognition of the hidden layer. The pressure from the quantum field itself, from the depth of reality, pushing toward the surface in the form of the very chaos and disruption that the surface layer is experiencing. The chaos is not only a weapon of control, it is also the pressure of the depth against a surface that can no longer contain it. The trembling in the city that Mara noticed was not only the result of misalignment, it was also the communication of the foundation. The disruption of the surface is not only engineered, it is also inevitable. Because the surface cannot hold indefinitely against the pressure of the depth. And this is the hidden layer of the moment we are living through. The spiritual endgame is not simply the final move of a system of control. It is the collision between a system of control and a force of expansion that the system cannot ultimately contain. It is the moment when the veil between the surface layer and the hidden layer becomes thin enough that the hidden layer becomes visible to those who are looking for it. And once visible, it cannot be re-hidden. Because once you have seen the depth, the surface can never again convince you that it is the whole truth. Now, let us go to the layer that most treatments of this subject never reach. Because there is something beneath the conflict between contraction and expansion, something beneath the war between the system that wants consciousness locked at the surface and the force that wants consciousness to recognize its own depth. Something that changes the meaning of both sides of that conflict. In quantum mechanics, there is a concept called the measurement problem. The problem is this. When a quantum system is observed, it collapses from superposition into a definite state. But what counts as observation? What constitutes a measurement? The original formulation of quantum mechanics required a conscious observer. But what is consciousness? Where does it come from? How does it interact with the quantum field? These questions have never been fully resolved. And the reason they have never been fully resolved is that they require going beneath the layer of physics, into the layer of the nature of consciousness itself. They require asking not just what consciousness does, but what consciousness is. And that question, at the deepest level, is not a physics question. It is the question that every mystical tradition in human history has been exploring. The deepest layer that quantum mechanics points to, but cannot fully enter, is the layer where consciousness is not a product of matter, but the ground of it. Not something that emerges from the physical, but something that the physical emerges from. The field of pure awareness that the Vedantic tradition called pure consciousness, that the Taoist tradition called the Tao, that the Hermetic tradition called the All, that the Kabbalistic tradition placed at the crown of the tree of life as Ein Sof, the infinite without end. This is the layer that has been hidden in plain sight, not hidden by conspiracy, not locked away by the keepers of esoteric knowledge, though the esoteric traditions have certainly been aware of it and have mapped it in their inner teachings. Hidden by the simple fact that it is so fundamental, so prior to everything else, that it cannot be seen by the ordinary surface-level mode of awareness. It can only be seen by awareness that has turned toward its own source, by consciousness that has looked not outward at the surface layer, but inward toward the depth from which all surfaces arise. And what is found there, what every tradition that has mapped this territory reports finding there, is not a void, not an absence, not nothingness in the nihilistic sense. What is found there is the opposite of nothingness. What is found there is the fullness from which all specific things arise, the infinite potential from which all collapsed actualities emerge, the pure awareness that is not aware of something, but is awareness itself, prior to the division between observer and observed. This is the deepest layer, and it is the layer that the spiritual endgame is ultimately about. Because if consciousness is not a product of matter, but the ground of it, then the entire premise of the surface-level world, the premise that you are a small, fragile, limited being in a vast, indifferent, fixed physical universe, is not merely incomplete, it is inverted. It is the surface layer mistaking itself for the depth. It is the painting declaring itself to be the canvas. And the system of surface-level control, whatever its mechanisms and motivations, depends entirely on that inversion being maintained. It depends on human consciousness continuing to believe that it is small, fragile, limited, and dependent. Because a consciousness that recognizes itself as the ground of the field it is observing, as the awareness from which the quantum potential collapses into actuality, is not a consciousness that can be controlled by manipulating its surface-level experience. It is not a consciousness that can be kept reactive by manufacturing threats. It is not a consciousness that can be fragmented by flooding it with noise, because it knows what it is beneath all of that. It knows the depth from which it arises, and from that knowing it operates at a layer that the surface-level system cannot reach. This is the invincibility that the ancient traditions spoke of. Not physical invincibility, not immunity to the events of the surface layer, but the invincibility of a consciousness that knows its own depth, that knows the layer from which it generates its reality. that knows that the surface layer, however compelling, however urgent, however loud, is not the whole truth, is not even the most important truth, is the thinnest outer layer of something infinite. Now let us talk about what this means practically, because everything we have covered so far has to land somewhere real, in your body, in your experience, in the way you move through the world that is currently shaking. Here is the practice. Right now, wherever you are, I want you to do something very simple. I want you to notice what you are paying attention to, not what you are thinking about, not what you are feeling, what you are paying attention to. Where is the beam of your awareness currently directed? Is it directed outward, at the surface layer, at the events and developments and movements of the world? Is it directed at the screen, at the narrative, at the question of what is happening and what it means, and what comes next? Or is it directed even slightly toward the awareness itself, toward the fact that you are aware, toward the presence that is here, noticing all of this? That second direction, the direction toward awareness itself, that is the direction toward the hidden layer. That is the direction the ancient traditions called the inner path. That is the direction that quantum mechanics, in its most philosophically honest formulations, points toward when it acknowledges that the observer cannot be separated from the observed. The practice is not complicated, but it is radical in the original sense of that word, radical meaning going to the root. It is the practice of turning attention toward its own source, of noticing not just what you are aware of, but that you are aware, of recognizing the awareness itself as distinct from its contents, the screen of consciousness as distinct from the images projected on it. When you do this, even briefly, something shifts. The surface layer does not disappear. The world is still moving. The events are still unfolding. But your relationship to them changes. Because you are no longer only inside the surface layer, reacting to it as though it were the whole of reality. You are simultaneously at the depth, at the layer of awareness itself, from which the surface layer is observable as a surface layer rather than as the totality of existence. This is what the ancient traditions called non-attachment. Not indifference, not withdrawal, not the pretense that the surface layer does not matter. Non-attachment in the precise sense of not being exclusively identified with the surface layer, of maintaining the awareness of the depth even while engaging with the surface, of knowing what you are beneath what is happening to you. And this is exactly what the system of surface-level control cannot tolerate, because a consciousness that maintains its awareness of the depth while engaging with the surface is a consciousness that cannot be fully captured by the surface. It can be influenced, it can be affected, it can experience the full range of human emotion in response to the events of the surface layer. But it cannot be convinced that the surface layer is all there is, and that unconvincibility, that rootedness in the depth, is the one thing the surface level system has no answer to. Feel what shifts when you recognize this, not intellectually, in your body, in the quality of your awareness right now. There is something that relaxes when the depth is recognized. not because the surface becomes less real or less challenging, but because the surface is no longer the only layer you are inhabiting. You have depth beneath you. You have ground beneath the ground. And that ground cannot be shaken by the trembling of the surface, because the trembling of the surface is happening on top of it. This is the layer the veil has been hiding. Not a fact about the world, a recognition about what you are. Now let us go to the layer beneath the practice, because the practice is a doorway, not a destination. The recognition of awareness as the hidden layer beneath the surface experience is the beginning of something, not the end of it. And what it is the beginning of is a different mode of participation in the world. Here is what the ancient traditions consistently describe about those who have gone beneath the surface layer and recognized the depth. They do not become passive. They do not retreat from the world. They do not float in abstract bliss while the surface layer continues its chaos. What they become is something more precise and more powerful than either passive withdrawal or reactive engagement. They become what the Taoist tradition called Wu Wei, effortless action, what the Bhagavad Gita called action without attachment to results, what the Hermetic tradition called working with the grain of the universe. They become, in the language we have been building throughout this transmission, consciousnesses that operate from the hidden layer while engaging with the surface. Consciousnesses that, because they know the depth, because they know the field of potential from which all surface realities arise, are capable of participating in the collapse of that potential into actuality in ways that are aligned with the deepest layer rather than merely reactive to the surface. This is not magic in the superstitious sense. This is the logical implication of what quantum mechanics describes. If consciousness participates in the collapse of quantum potential into definite reality, then a consciousness operating from a state of clarity, wholeness, and alignment with the deepest layer participates in that collapse differently than a consciousness operating from a state of fear, fragmentation, and reactive surface-level identification. The quality of consciousness matters. The state of awareness matters, not as a feel-good affirmation, but as a structural feature of how the hidden layer generates the surface. And this is the deepest layer of what the spiritual endgame is about. The endgame is not about which surface-level faction wins. It is not about which narrative prevails. It is not even about which system of control succeeds or fails. All of those are surface layer outcomes. The endgame is about what kind of consciousness humanity brings to the collapse of quantum potential into the next layer of its collective reality. The endgame is about whether the aggregate state of human consciousness, in this precise moment when the veil between the surface and the hidden layer is thinner than it has been in a very long time, collapses potential into a reality that reflects the depth, or one that reflects only the surface. And here is the thing that the source material gestures toward, but does not fully articulate in these terms. That outcome is not determined by the system of surface-level control. It is not determined by the architects of the endgame, whatever their sophistication and whatever their understanding of the architecture of consciousness. It is determined by you, by the aggregate of individual consciousnesses, each choosing, in each moment, which layer to operate from. This is not grandiosity. This is the logical implication of the quantum mechanics we have been examining. If consciousness is the mechanism of collapse, then the state of consciousness is the most powerful variable in the system, and the state of consciousness is the one thing that cannot be fully externally controlled. It can be influenced, it can be nudged, it can be made more difficult to access its own depth, but it cannot be prevented from accessing its own depth by any external force, because the depth is not outside of you. It is what you are beneath what you think you are. Let us go to the second parable now. Because there is a story that belongs here, a story about what it looks like when someone discovers the hidden layer, not in a moment of peace and contemplation, but in the middle of the storm. His name was Elias. He was not a mystic. He was not a philosopher. He was a man who had built his life on the surface layer with great skill and great investment. He understood the surface. He was good at navigating it. He had built structures, professional, personal, psychological, that were solid and reliable by every surface layer measure. And then the surface shook. Not gradually, the way Mara's city trembled, all at once. In the space of a single season, the structures Elias had built on the surface layer collapsed, not because he had done anything wrong, not because the surface was punishing him, simply because the surface is not the foundation, and structures built only on the surface are subject to the instability of the surface. Elias went through the stages that most people go through when the surface collapses. First, the attempt to rebuild on the surface, to find new surface layer structures to replace the ones that had fallen. But every time he tried to rebuild, the ground shifted again. The surface was not stable enough to build on. He could feel it. The trembling that Mara had noticed, he was inside it now. He was not an observer of it. He was a participant in its chaos. Then came the second stage, the rage at the surface, the conviction that the surface had betrayed him, that the systems he had trusted had failed him, that something or someone at the surface level was responsible for the collapse. He spent time in this stage. It is a real stage. The anger is real. The sense of betrayal is real, and it is not wrong to feel it, but it is a surface layer response to a surface layer event, and it did not change anything about the surface. Then, at a point he could not have predicted and could not have engineered, something shifted. Not in the world, in him, in the quality of his attention. He was sitting exhausted by the storm, no longer trying to fix the surface, no longer raging at it, simply sitting in the wreckage of what had been. And in that exhausted stillness, something that had been beneath the noise became audible. Not a voice, not a vision. Something more like a recognition, a sense of something that had been there the entire time, beneath the surface, beneath the structures, beneath the identity he had built on the surface layer. Something that had not been touched by the collapse. Something that was not a structure at all, but the awareness within which all structures, built and collapsed, had appeared. He could not name it at first. He did not have the language. He had not been given the maps, but he could feel it. And what he felt was not comfort in the ordinary sense. It was not reassurance that the surface would be rebuilt. It was something stranger and more profound than that. It was the recognition that the surface had never been the foundation, that what he had been protecting, what he had been building, what he had been afraid of losing, was the outermost layer of something that could not be lost because it was not a structure. It was the ground from which all structures arose. From that recognition, something changed in how Elias engaged with the surface. He did not stop engaging with it. He did not become indifferent to it. He did not pretend that the surface did not matter. But he stopped being only the surface. He stopped being only the structures and the identities and the roles. He became something that had those things, but was not reducible to them. He became someone who operated from the depth while engaging with the surface. And from that place, the rebuilding that happened was different, not because the surface had changed, because the consciousness engaging with the surface had changed, because the layer from which he was collapsing potential into actuality had shifted. And you are here, reading or listening to this transmission, not because the surface is comfortable. You are here because the surface is shaking, because something in you knows that the surface layer alone is not sufficient to navigate what is happening, because the question that leads beneath the surface is already forming in you, even if you have not yet fully articulated it. What is actually happening here? Not at the surface, beneath it. That question is the crack in the veil, and the answer, the real answer, the one that the ancient traditions mapped and quantum mechanics confirmed, and that this transmission has been systematically uncovering, is this. What is happening beneath the surface is a consciousness event, a moment in the long arc of human awareness when the hidden layer is becoming accessible to those who are ready to look. When the veil between the quantum depth and the manifest surface is thin enough that the depth can be felt even by those who have never been given the maps. When the pressure from below is sufficient to crack the surface and allow something that has always been there, waiting beneath everything, to become visible. And the war that is being fought in the hidden layer is not a war between good and evil in the surface level narrative sense. It is a war between contraction and expansion, between the force that wants consciousness to remain at the surface, fragmented and reactive and unaware of its own depth, and the force that is pulling consciousness toward its own recognition, toward the moment when enough human awareness has found the hidden layer that the aggregate state of consciousness begins to collapse a fundamentally different kind of reality out of the quantum field. This is the endgame. This is what has been hidden in plain sight beneath every headline, every conflict, every manufactured crisis, and every genuine disruption of the surface layer. The surface events are real, but they are not the event. They are the veil over the event. And the event is this: the moment of recognition, the moment when human consciousness, in sufficient numbers and sufficient depth, remembers what it is. Now let us talk about the three pillars. Because the source material identifies something precise here that deserves to be examined at a deeper level than it is usually taken. The claim is that the system of surface-level control operates through three mechanisms: thought, emotion, and will. Through information and ideology, it shapes what people think. Through fear and desire, it shapes what people feel. Through systems of distraction and dependency, it shapes how people act. And the result is a human being fragmented from within, constantly seeking external validation, unable to find the stillness that would allow the hidden layer to become accessible. This is accurate as a description of the surface-level mechanism. But there is a layer beneath it, because thought, emotion, and will are not merely levers of control. They are the three dimensions of human consciousness. And the reason they are effective as levers of control is that they are, in their natural state, the instruments by which consciousness engages with reality. They are the faculties through which awareness interacts with the quantum field and participates in the collapse of potential into actuality. Thought, in its natural state, is not the endless reactive commentary of the conditioned mind. It is the creative faculty of consciousness, the capacity to form intention, to hold a vision, to direct awareness toward a specific potential and participate in its collapse into actuality. The ancient traditions called this faculty logos, or the creative word. Not speech in the ordinary sense, but the formative power of consciousness to shape the field of potential. Emotion, in its natural state, is not the reactive storm of fear and desire that the surface layer generates. It is the energetic dimension of consciousness, the quality of aliveness that determines the frequency at which consciousness vibrates, and therefore the frequency of reality it resonates with and draws toward itself. The ancient traditions understood emotion as the bridge between thought and manifestation, between the formative intention and the actual collapse of potential into reality. Will, in its natural state, is not the grasping, striving, effortful pushing of the surface-level ego. It is the directive capacity of consciousness, the ability to sustain attention on a chosen direction without being deflected by the noise of the surface. The ancient traditions called this capacity tapas, or the sacred fire, the concentrated heat of sustained intention that transforms potential into actual. When these three faculties are functioning in their natural state, in alignment with the depth rather than captured by the surface, human consciousness is an extraordinarily powerful participant in the generation of reality. When they are fragmented, misdirected, and exhausted by the surface layer, human consciousness is a passive recipient of whatever reality the aggregate field is generating. The spiritual endgame at this layer is the battle for the natural functioning of these three faculties. The battle for thought that is creative rather than reactive, for emotion that is alive and resonant rather than fearful and contracted, for will that is sustained and directed rather than scattered and exhausted. And the recovery of these faculties does not require a revolution at the surface layer. It requires exactly the practice we described earlier. The turning of attention toward its own source. The recognition of the awareness that is prior to thought, prior to emotion, prior to will, because when awareness recognizes itself as the ground from which these faculties arise, it can relate to them differently. It can use them rather than be used by them. It can direct them rather than be directed by them. This is what the inner traditions called mastery, not the mastery of external circumstances, the mastery of the inner instruments, the reclamation of thought, emotion, and will from the surface level system that has been harvesting them, and their restoration to their natural function as instruments of creative participation in the generation of reality. And this is the practical dimension of the spiritual endgame for you right now, in the life you are actually living. Every time you notice a reactive thought and choose a creative one, you are reclaiming the faculty of thought from the surface level system. Every time you move through fear toward the awareness beneath it and find that the awareness itself is not afraid, you are reclaiming the faculty of emotion from the surface level system. Every time you choose to direct your attention toward the depth rather than scatter it across the surface, you are reclaiming the faculty of will from the surface level system. These are not small acts. At the quantum level, at the level of the hidden layer where consciousness participates in the collapse of potential into actuality, these are the most consequential acts available to a human being. Let us go now to the layer that the ancient traditions called the most dangerous truth. The layer that the esoteric traditions consistently identified as the one most carefully guarded. Not because it was evil, because it was the one that, once understood, made every system of surface-level control permanently obsolete. The dangerous truth is this: you are not in the field. You are not a small consciousness navigating a vast external quantum field that operates independently of you, and that you might, with sufficient skill, learn to influence. You are not separate from the field and reaching into it. You are the field, locally expressed, specifically individuated, but not separate. This is the Vedantic teaching of Atman and Brahman. The individual self and the universal self are not two different things. The individual awareness and the infinite awareness are not separate. The local consciousness and the non-local field are not in a relationship of inside and outside. They are two expressions of the same thing at different scales of resolution. This is not a metaphor. This is the structural implication of non-locality. If the quantum field is non-local, if there is no fundamental separation at the hidden layer, then the apparent separation at the surface layer is exactly that. Apparent. A surface layer feature of a reality that at its depth is not divided. And what this means for the spiritual endgame is this: the endgame is not you versus the system. It is not the awakened versus the controllers. It is not the light versus the dark. All of those are surface layer framings. The endgame, at the deepest layer, is the field recognizing itself. the non-local awareness becoming aware of its own non-locality through the local consciousness of individual human beings. The depth becoming visible to itself through the surface. This is what the mystical traditions called enlightenment. Not a personal achievement, not a state that belongs to a special few. The recognition by a specific local expression of consciousness of what it actually is. The moment when the wave recognizes that it is the ocean, not that it is separate from the ocean and somehow connected to it. That it is the ocean, locally expressed, temporarily waved, but never actually separate from the depth from which it arises. When that recognition occurs, the wave does not stop being a wave. The surface does not disappear. The local expression does not dissolve into undifferentiated unity, but the relationship to the surface changes completely. Because the wave that knows it is the ocean is not afraid of the storm. It is not threatened by the turbulence of the surface. It is not captured by the drama of the waves around it, because it knows what it is beneath the drama. It knows the depth from which all waves arise and to which all waves return. This is the invincibility that the ancient traditions pointed to, not the invincibility of a surface layer self that has become powerful enough to resist all threats. The invincibility of a consciousness that knows it is the field, that knows it is the depth, that knows the surface, however compelling, is the thinnest outer layer of what it actually is. And this is what the system of surface-level control has no answer to, because it operates entirely within the surface layer. All of its mechanisms, the distraction, the fear, the fragmentation, the manufactured urgency, operate at the level of the surface layer consciousness that believes itself to be small, separate, and threatened. The moment a consciousness recognizes itself as the field, as the depth, as the awareness that is prior to and generative of the surface layer, the surface level mechanisms no longer have traction. They still happen. The noise is still there. The events are still unfolding. But they are happening on the surface of something that the consciousness now knows itself to be. And that knowing is the end of captivity, not the end of challenge, not the end of engagement with the world, the end of the fundamental error that has made the captivity possible. The error of mistaking the surface for the depth, the error of believing that the outermost layer of reality is the whole of reality, the error of forgetting what you are beneath, what is happening to you. Now let us bring this to the community, because one of the things that the hidden layer reveals is that the individual recognition is not the end point. It is the beginning of something collective. The quantum field is non-local. Consciousness is not ultimately individual. The recognition that occurs in one local expression of the field resonates through the non-local whole. This is not mystical hand-waving. It is the structural implication of entanglement. When one consciousness shifts its state, the field it is entangled with, which is, at the hidden layer, all of consciousness, registers that shift. Not in a way that is always immediately visible at the surface layer, but in a way that is real at the level of the field. This is why the ancient traditions consistently emphasized the importance of communities of practice, not because the individual recognition is insufficient, but because the collective resonance of multiple consciousnesses that have found the hidden layer amplifies the signal in the field, creates a frequency that others can entrain to, makes the hidden layer more accessible to those who are approaching it but have not yet broken through. You, watching or listening to this transmission, are part of that resonance. The fact that you are here, that you have stayed through the layers of this exploration, that something in you recognized what was being described and said, yes, that is real, that is not nothing, that is a consciousness finding its own depth, and in doing so contributing to the collective field in which other consciousnesses are also finding theirs. The community that is gathering around this kind of exploration is not a movement in the surface layer political sense. It is not an organization or a faction or a side in the surface level conflict. It is a resonance, a frequency, a community of consciousnesses that have, to varying degrees and in various ways, found the hidden layer and are learning to operate from it. And the resonance of that community in the quantum field is, at the hidden layer, one of the most powerful forces currently active in the generation of the next layer of collective human reality. So when I ask you to share what hidden layer you found during this transmission, I am not asking for a comment to boost an algorithm. I am asking you to contribute your recognition to the collective field, to add your frequency to the resonance, to say, in whatever words feel true for you, I have been here. I have gone beneath the surface. I have found the layer beneath the layer, and this is what I found. Has there been a truth that was hidden in plain sight until you were finally ready to see it, something you always sense was beneath the surface, but couldn't articulate until a specific moment cracked it open for you? Tell the community what you found when you finally looked directly at it. What word describes the deepest layer you reached in this transmission? Drop it below, not as a performance, as a contribution to the field. Let us now move to the integration. Everything we have covered in this transmission, the quantum mechanics of the hidden layer, the ancient maps of the depth, the nature of the spiritual endgame, the practice of turning attention toward its own source, the recognition of the self as the field, the community of resonance, all of it is pointing toward a single integration principle. The integration principle is this: reality has two layers, and you have access to both. The surface layer is real, the events are happening, the conflict is real, the noise is real, the challenges are real. You do not have to pretend otherwise. You do not have to deny the surface in order to access the depth. The depth does not require you to abandon the surface. It requires you to know that the surface is the surface. To know that beneath it is a layer that is more fundamental, more generative, and more responsive to the state of your consciousness than the surface layer ever could be. And from that knowing, you engage with the surface differently, not from above it, looking down with detachment, not from beside it, observing from a safe distance, from beneath it, from the depth, from the layer that is generating the surface, from the awareness that is prior to and participative in the collapse of potential into the specific reality you are experiencing. This is not a technique. It is not a practice you do for 20 minutes in the morning and then set aside. It is a shift in the fundamental orientation of your consciousness, a shift from surface-level identification to depth-level recognition, from the wave that thinks it is only a wave to the wave that knows it is the ocean, from the surface that believes itself to be the foundation to the awareness that knows itself as the depth from which the surface arises. And once that shift occurs, once that recognition lands, not just intellectually but in the body, in the felt sense of what you are, everything changes. Not the surface. You, the consciousness that meets the surface, the awareness that participates in the collapse of potential into the reality you experience. This is the veil lifting, not the veil over some external truth, the veil over what you are, and what you are beneath the surface of everything you have been taught to believe about yourself is not a small, fragile, limited being navigating an indifferent universe. You are the awareness from which the universe arises, the field expressing itself locally, the depth appearing as a surface, the infinite appearing as a specific, embodied, temporally located consciousness that is, in this precise moment, remembering what it is. That remembering is the spiritual endgame, not the endgame of a system of control, the endgame of a long arc of forgetting, the moment when the field recognizes itself, when the depth becomes visible to itself through the surface, when the wave remembers the ocean. This is what has been hidden in plain sight beneath every layer we have peeled back today. Beneath the surface chaos of the world, beneath the quantum mechanics of the hidden layer, beneath the ancient maps of the depth, beneath the parable of Mara and the trembling city, beneath the story of Elias in the wreckage of the surface, beneath the 3 pillars of consciousness and their reclamation, beneath the dangerous truth that you are not in the field but are the field, beneath all of it the same recognition, the same truth that was always there, waiting for your awareness to look deep enough to find it. You are not separate from what you are looking for. You are it, and now you have seen beneath the surface. The veil is thinner than you think, and you have just seen through it. What has been revealed cannot be re-hidden. You have looked beneath the surface layer of the world and found the hidden layer that generates it. You have found the quantum field beneath the manifest, the ancient map beneath the modern confusion, the depth beneath the surface, and most importantly, you have found the awareness that you are beneath the surface level identity you have been carrying. You are no longer only a surface dweller. You see the depth now, and from the depth, the surface looks different, not less real, not less important, but no longer the whole truth, no longer the only layer, no longer the foundation. The foundation is what you are. The world you are watching unfold is not the event. It is the veil over the event, and now you can see through it, not because someone gave you a new narrative to replace the old one, because you went beneath the narrative layer entirely, because you found the layer that generates narratives, because you found the depth from which all surfaces arise. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. Welcome to the hidden layer. It was always here. You just hadn't looked deep enough yet, and now you have. If this transmission opened something in you, if you felt the veil lift at any point during this exploration, share what you found. Tell the community of depth seekers gathering here what layer you reached. What word describes what you found at the bottom of this dig? Your recognition is not just yours, it is a contribution to the field, a frequency that others who are approaching the same depth can entrain to, a signal that the hidden layer is accessible, that the veil is thin, that the depth is real. If you know someone who is feeling the trembling of the surface but hasn't yet been shown what lies beneath it, send them this transmission. You are not sharing content. You are lifting the veil for someone else, giving them access to a layer they have sensed but couldn't reach alone. Two consciousness fields meeting at the depth create a resonance that neither could generate in isolation. That act of sharing is itself a participation in the collapse of the field toward recognition. Like this transmission, if it took you somewhere the surface layer never has, the spiritual endgame is happening, and its outcome lies not in the hands of those who control the surface. It lies in the awareness of those who have found the depth. You have found it. Now go deeper. There is a transmission that maps the territory directly beneath this one. Your thoughts are not private, explores the hidden network beneath your mind, the layer where individual consciousness connects to a field that is already being read, already being shaped, and already shaping you back. If you felt the non-locality of the quantum field in this exploration, that transmission will show you exactly how deep that connection goes.